in shaping human thought, behavior, and identity. Section 2: The Study of Sound. Its Ecological and Psychological Effects. Chapter 2: The Canyon That Roared, a Field Guide to Noise, Nerves, and How Nature Can Be Surprisingly Loud. Key terms to know before you wander in: soundscape, sound versus noise, decibels dB and logarithmic scale, reverberation acoustic amplification, National Park Service NPS versus Federal Aviation Administration FAA, multisensory perception, landscape assessment methods, experimental manipulation, replication, environmental perception, sensation versus perception. Questions to keep in mind while reading: why did the Grand Canyon become the birthplace of soundscape research? What makes sound behave differently in a canyon compared to open space? Why was aircraft noise so difficult to regulate? How can sound completely change perception when the visual scene stays the same? How do researchers move from messy real-world problems to controlled experiments? Why is replication essential in environmental psychology research? Why the name Roaring Lion Canyon is used, and surprisingly appropriate. There are few places on Earth that seem less in need of improvement than the Grand Canyon. It is vast, ancient, and generally minding its own business. It is also, as it turns out, an excellent place to learn how good humans can be at either crashing a picturesque wedding party, sometimes quite literally, or at the very least, ruin a perfectly good silence. The modern study of soundscapes, which sounds like something involving ambient music and scented candles, actually began with a problem involving helicopters, legislation, and a canyon that behaved like a giant acoustic amplifier. A brief history of how to make a canyon unnecessarily loud. In 1987, amid growing concern about aircraft noise, John McCain helped push legislation aimed at addressing overflights in the Grand Canyon. At the time, helicopters were flying low, frequently, and with a level of enthusiasm usually reserved for stunt pilots and people who have not yet considered the consequences. There were two immediate complications. First, there were the helicopter crashes, which tend to focus the mind. Second, and more persistently irritating, there was the noise. Lots of it. A perfect bureaucratic stalemate. Responsibility for fixing the problem was split between two agencies. National Park Service controls the land. Federal Aviation Administration controls the airspace. This arrangement ensured that neither could fully solve the problem, which is a time-honored tradition in administrative design. The Park Service could not regulate aircraft. The FAA could not easily prioritize natural quiet. The result was delay, debate, and a great many helicopters continuing to do exactly as they pleased. Just how bad was it? Researchers, who are often called in when things become both measurable and irritating, began collecting data. The findings were not subtle. Aircraft noise was audible about 79% of the time. On busy days. Roughly 43 helicopters every 20 minutes near the Colorado River. This is less occasional disturbance and more continuous airborne parade. Pilots, operating under minimal restrictions, could fly nearly anywhere, even dip below the canyon rim, which, as it turns out, is exactly where the canyon begins to behave like an echo chamber. The canyon as an acoustic trap. The key concept is that sound behaves differently in a canyon. In open space, sound disperses outward and upward. In a canyon, sound reflects off walls. It becomes trapped. It reverberates. The result is amplification. A helicopter up to 16 miles away could still be heard clearly. This is quite astonishing, in the way that seeing your humble abode burglarized by a bandit armed with only a leaf blower is astonishing. The people who suffered most were least able to leave. The primary complainants were river rafters. This makes sense when you consider their situation. Deep inside the canyon, surrounded by reflective rock surfaces, experiencing amplified, persistent noise. They had come for solitude and instead received an experience that should have only been marketed to plane spotters. Eventually, someone did something. After years of discussion, regulation arrived. By 1996, helicopter flights were capped at about 95,000 per year, which sounds like a lot, and it is. Most of these flights occur over roughly 5 months, many originating from Las Vegas, producing a seasonal concentration of noise over the entire area, that is best described as being beaten into submission. Why this changed science? Before this episode, most noise research focused on cities, sirens, traffic, construction, and the occasional frat house. The Grand Canyon raised a different question. How do you study noise in a place that is supposed to be quiet? This led to the birth of modern soundscape research focusing on natural versus human-made sounds, visitor experience, wildlife impacts. In short, it forced researchers to take nature seriously as an acoustic environment, not just a visual one. From canyon to laboratory, making noise on purpose. In the early 1990s, a researcher working in the Grand Canyon began collecting audio recordings, photographs, visitor perception data. This fieldwork eventually migrated into the lab, and then a controlled laboratory study published in 1999, which is how one turns a chaotic canyon full of helicopters into a carefully calibrated experiment. The experiment. Participants were shown scenic images of the canyon paired with different sound conditions. Ambient sound, wind, birds, natural background, and no human noise. Helicopter noise, 40 dB. Noticeable, but mild. Helicopter noise, 80 dB. Loud and intrusive. This is a classic multisensory landscape assessment. Visual stimulus stays constant. Only sound is manipulated. What people actually rated. Participants evaluated. Scenic quality. Naturalness. Solitude. Tranquility. Freedom. Annoyance. And overall preference. Which is a polite way of asking, how much is this ruining your day? The results, which were not subtle. Noise had a dramatic effect. Increased annoyance. Decreased. Scenic beauty. Perceived naturalness. Tranquility. Sense of solitude. The important point. The image never changed. Only the sound did. A moment of healthy scientific skepticism. The researcher, quite reasonably, suspected something had gone wrong. The effect was too strong. So they did what good scientists do. Repeated the study. Controlled for bias. The results held. This is proof positive that 1. Perception is not just sensation. Same visual input. Different experience due to sound. 2. Sound can redefine a landscape. A beautiful scene can feel degraded purely through noise. 3. Sound versus noise. Helicopter sound becomes noise because it is unwanted. It violates expectations of natural quiet. 4. Research methods matter. Field observation, lab experiment, replication. This is the relevant scientific cycle. Why this chapter exists at all? Because the Grand Canyon revealed something slightly disappointing. You can stand in one of the most visually spectacular places on Earth and still feel like you are next to an airport. And that feeling is not incidental. It is measurable, predictable, and, with enough effort, fixable. Summary and conclusion. The Grand Canyon case marked a turning point in environmental psychology by shifting noise research from urban settings to natural environments. Key takeaways. Soundscapes are a critical part of environmental experience. Noise is not defined by volume alone, but by context and expectation. Canyon acoustics amplify and prolong sound through reverberation. Regulatory challenges arose from split authority between National Park Service, Federal Aviation Administration. Multisensory experiments show that sound alone can dramatically alter perception. Replication confirmed that these effects are robust and reliable. At a broader level, environmental perception is constructed, not simply received. Sound is as influential as sight in shaping experience. Managing soundscapes is essential for both human well-being and ecological integrity. Structured study. Soundscape research development. Originated from real-world noise issues. Progression. Lab experiments, field methods, applied research. Grand Canyon case study. Problem. Aircraft overflights, helicopters. High noise levels. Safety concerns. Key issue. Split authority. National Park Service land. Federal Aviation Administration airspace. Noise exposure data. Audible 79% of the time. 43 helicopters every 20 minutes peak. Canyon acoustics. Sound reflects off canyon walls. Reverberation amplifies noise. audible up to 16 miles away. Most affected group. River rafters. Reason. Deep canyon location. Amplified, constant exposure. Policy outcome. Flight cap, 95,000/year. Concentrated seasonal activity. Research significance. Shift from urban noise natural environments. Led to development of soundscape ecology. Experimental study of 1999. Design. Visual images plus controlled sound. Conditions. Ambient. Helicopter, 40 dB. Helicopter, 80 dB. Measured variables. Scenic quality. Naturalness. Solitude. Tranquility. Freedom. Annoyance. Preference. Findings. Noise increases annoyance. Decreases all positive evaluations. Sound alone alters perception profoundly. Replication. Study repeated. Results confirmed. Conceptual connections. Perception versus sensation. Sound versus noise. Multisensory environmental evaluation. Test your understanding. Why was the Grand Canyon important in soundscape research? Why is noise amplified in a canyon? Why was regulation difficult? How do researchers experimentally study soundscapes? What did the lab study demonstrate about perception? Why is replication important? Chapter 4. Etu. An extension on canyon research and soundscape science. Key terms to know before you read. Soundscape. The total acoustic environment as perceived by humans and other organisms. Sound versus noise. Sound is neutral. Noise is unwanted or disruptive, decibels, dB. Logarithmic unit measuring sound intensity, annoyance. Standard metric for how disturbing a sound is, tranquility and solitude. Legally relevant experiential qualities in protected wilderness, anthrophony. Human-generated sound, biophony, sound produced by living organisms, geophony. Natural non-living sound, wind, water, etc., and ecological validity. How well research reflects real-world conditions, experimental control, the ability to isolate cause and effect relationships. Questions to consider while reading. Why does sound have such a strong effect on how we perceive a place? How can the same landscape feel completely different depending on sound? Why is annoyance such a central measure in sound research? What trade-offs exist between laboratory and field studies? How do researchers balance realism with control? There are few places on Earth more visually convincing than a canyon. They are vast, dignified, and generally bestow a religious experience, like a cathedral to the god of time, built by time itself. One expects silence and reverence there. Unfortunately, as we've heard before, helicopters came crashing into these cathedrals. In the late 20th century, researchers discovered that certain national parks, including the celebrated Grand Canyon National Park and later Bryce Canyon National Park, had developed an unexpected acoustic personality. It was less natural wonder and more aerial interchange. Unlike the turbulence of the noise, the result was clear and clean. Visitors were miffed. This created a problem not just for the barking mad hikers, but for science. Up to that point, most noise research had focused on cities, where noise is expected in the same way that pigeon poop is expected. Parks, however, come with different birds and a different contract. They are meant to provide tranquility, solitude, and the illusion that the modern world has been banished. So researchers did what researchers do when faced with beautiful outdoor sights and sounds. They retreated to the laboratory. The art of simulating silence and ruining it. Imagine a participant seated comfortably in a lab. Before them is a sweeping image of a canyon. On their ears sit headphones. Everything appears serene. Then, depending on the experimental condition, one of three things happens. They hear only natural sounds: wind, distant birds, the acoustic equivalent of a deep breath. They hear a helicopter at about 40 dB. Noticeable, mildly intrusive. They hear a helicopter at 60-80 dB. Unmistakable, attention-grabbing, and about as subtle as a leaf blower in a library. Participants then rate the scene using simple scales. For example, not scenic at all, very scenic. Not annoying, extremely annoying. It is all very orderly, very controlled, and slightly mischievous in the way it reveals how fragile a sense of peace really is. What researchers measure, and why it matters. 1. Annoyance. This is the undisputed champion of noise research metrics. It has been used for roughly a century and answers a straightforward question. How much does this bother you? Annoyance matters because it captures the subjective disruption caused by sound. Two environments can have identical decibel levels, yet produce very different reactions depending on context. 2. Tranquility and solitude. These are not poetic luxuries. They are grounded in policy, specifically the Wilderness Act of 1964, which requires protected areas to provide opportunities for both. 3. Preference. This is the overall judgment. Do you like the place? Would you stay? Would you return? It combines visual and auditory input into a single verdict, which, as it turns out, is heavily influenced by what you hear. Researchers measure them using rating scales, turning what sounds like dreamy grandeur into something more like having a book dropped on your face. Nonetheless, they found the results: a staircase of discontent. Across multiple studies, including those inspired by conditions in Haleakala National Park, the findings are so consistent they resemble a diagram on the patterns of OCD. Natural sound. Lowest annoyance. Highest tranquility, solitude, and preference. Moderate noise, 40 dB. Noticeable rise in annoyance. Decline in positive ratings. Higher noise, 60-80 dB. Sharp increase in annoyance. Marked drop in tranquility, solitude, and preference. An congruent description of this pattern is a staircase, which is no exaggeration. Each step upward in noise, negative, produces a corresponding step downward in perceived environmental quality, all of the positives. The remarkable detail is that the visual scene never changes. The canyon remains majestic. The rocks remain ancient. Only the sound shifts, and yet the entire experience is reinterpreted. What this reveals about the human mind. This is where things get deeper. The experiments demonstrate that sensation and perception are not the same. The visual input stays constant. The interpretation changes with sound. Sound shapes meaning. A helicopter is not just a sound wave. It signals intrusion, disruption, and human presence. Context determines whether sound becomes noise. The same helicopter might be acceptable near a city. In a canyon, it sounds, in the most scientific sense, like a mosquito as heavy as a helicopter buzzing right into your ear canal. The lab versus the wild. At this point, as you might have surmised, a reasonable person might object. Yes, but a laboratory is not a canyon. Correct. It is missing cliffs, weather, existential reflection, not to mention even a whiff of color. And this leads to one of the central debates in environmental psychology. Laboratory studies. High control. Clear cause and effect relationships. Lower ecological realism. Field studies. Real-world complexity. High ecological validity. Less control over variables. Guess what the current consensus is? Use both. If laboratory results match field observations, confidence increases. But if they diverge, there's something weird going on. Check your sanity and try again. Why this matters more than it first appears. At first glance, this might seem like an elaborate way of confirming that Sherlock Holmes would have been a very bored scientist. Of course, loud pipes save egos and not lives. But the implications are broader.